Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Amelia and today it is the start of a new month, so of course I want to go ahead and talk about everything that I read last month. So I feel like I had a pretty decent reading month in April. I actually read 3 audiobooks, nonfiction audiobooks, and then 6 physical books, all of them fantasy, I think. Yeah, not a lot of diversity in the reading this month, but that's okay. I feel like when you know what you like to read, there's not necessarily a lot of point in forcing yourself to read books that you know you're not going to be as interested in. Alright, the first book that I read this month was Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne, and I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. So what can I say about this book? I obviously really love this book because I gave it 5 stars. And I felt that this book really successfully built on the stakes and the conflict from the first book. And I liked how the characters were able to move forward both in terms of achieving their goals and also as people. One thing that I felt was really interesting, or I'm curious to see how it progresses, is he kind of makes the good and evil boundary sort of blur a little bit in interesting ways, because obviously the dragon god Likrifa is presented as the evil one because she wants to take over the world with her followers. However, she says that she's not interested in making everybody who's not one of her followers a thrall. And then on the other hand, we have Elvar, who's one of our main characters, who's kind of presented as being kind of one of the good guys because she's fighting against Likrifa, but she takes thralls. So this kind of makes you question if Elvar really is a good character, or is she going to be one of the evil ones? Especially since through other perspectives, it really shows the tainted as good people. So it will be interesting to see if he gives Elvar some sort of redemption arc. Does she realize that taking thralls is a bad thing to do, or is he gonna lean more into making her kind of a secondary evil, maybe the lesser evil, so to speak? I don't know. In terms of the overall storyline, I felt that each of the characters' storylines connected to the main plot in really meaningful and interesting ways. Although I'm interested to see how, I think it's the Bloodsworn who go off to another continent in search of one of their people who's been kidnapped, so I'll be really interested to see how he weaves their storyline back into the main one, and whether or not their little side quest has an impact on the main quest and some deeper connections. So that's something to look forward to in the third book. But overall, I felt the characters in the story was able to move a significant amount towards the conclusion without it being super easy and straightforward. So it doesn't suffer from the same thing as some books do, where it just feels the characters are suffering and they're not getting anywhere and the story's not progressing. With this one, I felt progressed really well, while also still leaving a lot of stuff unresolved for us to look forward to in the next book. Alright, the next thing I read was an audiobook for The Body Keeps the Score. So this is a nonfiction book, and it's all about trauma and its effects on the brain and body. And it kind of starts in kind of a chronological sort of fashion, detailing the author's experience treating PTSD and trauma, specifically in war veterans, and talking about how the treatments that are available for PTSD have progressed since early days of shell shock in war veterans. And then later chapters explore more of different types of trauma, specifically childhood trauma and that's effects on the body and brain, specifically how they differ from adult PTSD, adult onset PTSD. And then in the final chapters, it kind of really talks a lot about it goes into depth on specific treatment methods and how they can be used for different types of trauma and for different patients, obviously. And I did really enjoy the first kind of half of the book. However, towards the end, I just kind of started to feel he added too many descriptions of trauma. He was very graphic in describing the trauma, which I can kind of understand having 1 or 2 of those descriptions maybe towards the front of the book, so that the reader understands how bad these traumas are, what the scale of the things happening that have happened to these people can be and so that it gives you a bit of more context for how severe the effects of the trauma can be on people. However, he just there were too many, and it started to feel very voyeuristic, I guess. He was he was just doing it to add extra shock value to the book. And I felt this really kind of distracted and took away from the message and the discussion of treatment in the book. Like he wanted to give like, it felt like he was like trying to give readers a little take-home trauma or something. I don't know. I really didn't like the excessive descriptions of trauma in this book. However, if that's something you're able to get by, or you can like skip over the pages, fast forward the audiobook or whatever, I think there are a lot of insights into like the treatment of PTSD and stuff that were very enlightening and interesting to learn more about, because it's something that I haven't really had much education on, so I'm always glad to learn something new. The next book I read was Black Wolves by Kate Elliott, and I gave this one 3.5 out of 5 stars. So I initially chose to read this book because I'm really interested in exploring more female fantasy authors, especially outside of like the main like couple that you see on booktube, like Robin Hobb, Ursula K. Le Guin, those kind of people. I was just looking to expand my knowledge of female authors. And I did really enjoy this book. It's quite light actually on like the fantasy elements. Like there are giant eagles that are in the book quite a lot. There are demons in this world that have caused a lot of the events to happen, but they're really not super like present in most of the plot, and a lot of the plot is really just kind of like a political fantasy kind of deal. I really enjoyed the first like 50 or so pages. They're following a character called Kellis during his like service to the king, and then we have a time skip of like 40 years or something, and we're following one of the king's daughters. The king is now dead. A whole bunch of stuff has happened, and I really felt like this like time skip kind of like threw me for a loop. Like I really didn't like know what was happening after this time skip. Like, and obviously like that makes sense, but like I found it hard to get back into the story and be interested in the new main character. And I definitely felt like there were like some pacing issues surrounding this time skip, and it took me like another 100 or so pages to get like properly back into the book. And then once I did, I really enjoyed it. Like I found that the main character, our new main character, the king's daughter, was flawed in some really interesting ways that were very like unique and understandable for like her character and backstory. And then we began to like fill in a lot of the things that happened during the time skip, which was really interesting to like know where you started and where you have to get to, but you still have to find out all the stuff that happens in the middle. So that was a really interesting way to explore the story that we had skipped. And I felt like where it ended was a really good setup for a really awesome second book to kick off. And then I went to the library website to request the next book. They didn't have it. Okay, this happens sometimes. So I went to the internet to look for the next book. And what did I discover? The publisher dropped the series. So I got so excited for the next book, only to discover it doesn't exist, and we have no idea when it will ever exist. Like if she manages to get her rights back, she could publish it from another company, but apparently that can take a really long time. So I have no idea if or when we are ever going to get another book, and that is really disappointing. Next up is Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. And this was my first Brandon Sanderson book, and I did really enjoy it. I talked quite a bit in depth about it in my video where I read this book, so I won't go like crazy into depth here, but like for like a Cole's Notes version, this book is about our girl Tress, and she lives on an island where no one's allowed to leave, but then one day her man gets kidnapped by the sorcerer, so she leaves the island, and we follow along all of her adventures and misadventures as she sails the deadly 4 seas to get her man back. I found that Tress as a character was really well written and interesting. She's like quirky without it being over the top quirky, and the story's told in a kind of from a unique kind of perspective. There's like a first person omniscient narrator, I think that's what you call it, and I haven't read very much from that perspective, so it was really interesting to discover something from that perspective. But I don't think I would want to read like a ton of stuff from that point of view. Like it was interesting for one book, like a standalone book, but I don't think I'd want to read like a whole series. I think it would be kind of a lot, like specifically from like this narrator's kind of voice, like tone, I guess you would say. And then the only other thing that I kind of didn't super love about this book was the way that like technology is kind of blended with like an otherwise medieval world. I don't usually find that works very well for me, so. But other than that, I really enjoyed this book, and I definitely recommend it for anybody who's like looking to get into Sanderson and doesn't know where to start, because this, I think it's part of one of his bigger worlds or series, but it doesn't really matter. I didn't feel like I was missing out on anything when I was reading this book. Like I didn't feel like there was any information that I was missing, so Yeah, that is Tress of the Emerald Sea. After Tress, I read Brothers of the Wind by Tad Williams. I give this one 4 out of 5 stars. So this is a shorter book set in the world of Austin Ard. I'm not sure that you would quite call it a novella, because it's like, I think 250 pages, so I think you would say it's a novel. But it's certainly a lot shorter than anything else that I've read in the Austin Ard world. And this follows 2 of the Zendaya. I don't really know how you're supposed to say it, but anyway, 2 of their princes, and they go out on an adventure because a group of mortals show up in their city and are begging for help because a dragon has come out of the wilderness and is terrorizing people, eating cattle, livestock, and all that good stuff. And we are following their quest to kill the dragon, and it's told from the POV of Hakatri's squire Kess, who is not a Zendaya, he's a changeling. So they're kind of viewed as like second-class citizens, so for him to be a squire to Hakatri is very like special and unique. He's like the only one of his species who is a squire. And so alongside their quest to kill the dragon, as they're like going around talking to different people trying to figure out how the hell you kill a dragon, Kess starts to learn a lot more about himself and his people that he didn't even realize he didn't know. And his new discoveries really like challenge his belief in his duty to serve Hakatri and like the honor in serving him. And he begins to really think about like what he would want from his life if he wasn't serving Hakatri, but he's so loyal that having these thoughts kind of like disturbs him, really kind of throws him for a loop. Like the other of Williams' work that I've read, I felt it was really well written, and it was really interesting to be able to explore like the earlier times in Austin Ard, because these characters are mentioned a little bit in the last King of Austin Ard series, so it was really interesting to explore like what they actually did when they were alive and how they're still relevant up till that time. I felt Kess made a really interesting main character. Like, it was an interesting choice to tell the story not from like the point of view of the guy who's like the hero, but like telling it from a smaller player's perspective. But it was really interesting to see how he like developed, challenged his beliefs, and was able to kind of become a person in his own right, other than by just being Hakatri's squire. And I really felt this book was like the perfect length. I think some authors might have been tempted to make it longer, stretch it out more, explore more like the characters, more of Kess's feelings maybe. But I don't know, I think it just worked really well as a shorter book. The pacing was really good. We didn't spend too much time just like sitting around planning. We were doing stuff all the time, which I really enjoyed. I felt like it was a pretty good balance of plot and character development. If you haven't read anything from Austin Ard, I don't know that this would be the best place to start, because it doesn't really explain in depth a lot of the stuff that has happened for like the world and like the people to get to this point. Like, it is kind of talked about a little bit, but it doesn't provide like a ton of context. I think he's kind of like assumed that you've read some other stuff in the Austin Ard world before this, so I would also maybe recommend you read something else before this one, but I don't think you would be like lost or anything. There's just like some other context that might be nice to have. Okay, next up I read The Obelisk Gate by N.K. Jemisin, and this is the second book in the Broken Earth trilogy. And I give this one 3.75 out of 5 stars. Again, it was a pretty good second book. It is a second book reading kind of month, I guess. I felt it did follow up pretty well on the stuff that happened in the first book, and it was able to build on like the characters and the stakes that were established in the first book. It was really interesting to finally get Nassen's perspective and see what she's been up to this whole time that Esan has been out looking for her. I still don't really like the second person like you thing that it does all the time, but I'm kind of getting used to it now, so like it doesn't upset me. But I think to talk about this book, I'm gonna have to go into some spoilers, because some of the things that I have to say about this book I can't really say without giving some spoilers. So if you're interested in reading this book and you don't want to hear any spoilers, you should click ahead now. Okay, so the thing that I found kind of confusing in this book was like, they're trying to catch the moon, right? Because the moon is like the Earth's sun or something, which was kind of confusing and not super well explained. But like, I don't understand why, if the moon is the Earth's sun, then he's fighting against like the Stone Eaters and the Origines, who are trying to bring the moon back and catch it. And I feel like that could have been explained a lot better, because it's kind of like the whole solution to everything that's happening in this world, but it's not like super well explained, not like super well fleshed out. I felt like I kind of missed something, and maybe I did, maybe it's just on me that I don't understand it because I just wasn't paying enough attention. But it didn't quite feel like super well explained to me. This entry was like really focused on Nasun and Isun developing their powers, which is kind of interesting, but yeah, again, like it kind of like lacks a little bit of like context with like the moon and the earth and what's this whole like fight with the Stone Eaters about even. It's like, I feel like that could have been developed a little bit more, like explained a little bit better. And it kind of feels like there's not that much left to do in the third book, because like Eslan has already, like, from what I understand, she learns how to use this obelisk gate in the end of this second book. So it seems like for the next book, all that she should have to do is actually catch the moon. So I'll be interested to see how she expands on that in the third book, because it feels like there's not that much left to do, and that it could have almost been wrapped up in this book if we just like pared down on some other stuff, or maybe just had a few more pages even would be fine. So we'll have to see how I feel about the third book, if it is justified in being 3 books, or if I feel like it could have been 2. Next, I listened to another audiobook called The Once and Future Sex by Eleanor Janika, and I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. So this is a non-fiction book about medieval women and their role in society, and it really wasn't quite what I was expecting. Like, I kind of just chose it because I needed an audiobook, and I was like scrolling through the available section, and this one was available, sounded kind of interesting, so I downloaded it. But it really spends a lot of time focused on what medieval men thought about medieval women, which really wasn't what I thought I was getting into. I was expecting it to focus on like women's day-to-day lives and their roles as workers, which it did explore in like the second half. It talked about the different jobs that they could have and what kind of rules and regulations there were around women working. But the first half of the book was really a lot about what medieval men thought about medieval women, which I understand why there is a lot of the male perspective, just because a lot of the works that have survived from that time are all by medieval men and not by the women, because they had less access to writing things down and spreading them, disseminating them. But it did spend like a lot of time talking about what men thought about women, which doesn't feel super relevant for like a book that's supposed to be about women's role in society. Like, I want to hear more about the women's perspective when possible. It spent a lot of time talking about what men thought the ideal woman should like look like and behave like, which doesn't feel super relevant in a book that's supposed to be about the medieval women. That's more about what men thought about women. Feels like not quite the same perspective, I guess. I don't know. When I'm reading a book about women, I want to hear about the women and not so much about what the men thought about the women. But I did think it was kind of interesting the way she kind of tried to like weave that into what the women's reaction was to the men's thoughts on them and like the beauty standards. Because it's kind of like a similar thing to like what we have today, where the men were like, you should look this way, but you shouldn't do anything at all to achieve that. You should just be naturally what the men think you should be. Like, if the beauty standard is to have high, thin eyebrows, they should just be that way. You shouldn't pluck them or do anything to achieve that. Which I think is still totally relevant to today, because I think a lot of men still kind of feel like that way. You know, the whole like, ooh, take her swimming on the first date. It's like, you need to look this way, but you shouldn't do anything to do it, because if you do, then you're a liar and you're having one on, even though I'm enforcing beauty standards on you that are unrealistic. So I felt like that discussion was interesting and definitely had a good place in this book, because she's kind of discussing a little bit about like the connections between what was expected of medieval women and what's expected of modern women. Another section that I found that was kind of interesting was she had this really extended discussion on medieval sex and how the church thought that any sex that was not for the sole purpose of making babies was sinful and you shouldn't have it, and even if you are having it to have a baby, you shouldn't enjoy it. It's just about making babies, otherwise it's a sin. And it also kind of touched on like all the misconceptions about women's sexuality in that time, and also like their reproductive organs, and how the men just had no clue what was going on. And I mean, even like the women to an extent, obviously they didn't have all the medical knowledge that we have now about like what's going on inside of a woman. So it was interesting to kind of hear about how they tried to explain that away and how they tried to deal with the problems that arose in that area. And then after that, we got into the section that I was kind of expecting more of the book to be, which was like talking about women's role in the workforce and what kind of jobs they did, and how much of a misconception it is that women only started working recently, because even in the medieval time, pretty much all women worked to some capacity. They were expected to work whether or not they were just working alongside like their husbands in the field, or if they had their own career in there were certain like fields that women were allowed to have their own kind of careers in. So it was interesting to hear about how women worked in both their own capacity and with their husbands or their families. And just overall, it was a really interesting book. I just felt that it did spend kind of too much time focused on what men think, like, or what men thought. Like, we hear so much about what men think, and sometimes I just don't want to hear it. I don't care. Sometimes I don't care. I want to hear what the women think. Alright, next up, I finally finished Path of Daggers by Robert Jordan. I think I started this book like maybe 2 months ago, and then I got distracted, and sometimes it's hard to get back into the Wheel of Time books because I'll like start a few pages and then get distracted by something else, and then jumping back into like the middle of a book, I'm kind of like, I don't remember what's happening. I don't want to start again. But I did get back into this, and then I ended up giving it 4.5 out of 5 stars. It is kind of hard to talk about or like review the middle Wheel of Time books without giving away stuff that happens in the first 7 books. Like this is number 8. So I'm not going to go too in depth in it because I don't really feel like there's much that I can talk about without spoiling the first 7 books. So I'll try to be kind of vague. One of the criticisms I hear a lot for Wheel of Time is that like the middle books get kind of boring or they drag on a lot, and I think there is some merit to that comment, but I did really enjoy this one. Like, it might be because it's one of like the smaller Wheel of Time books, shorter Wheel of Time books, that like the pacing and everything in this book felt really good. Like, a lot of things were happening. Like in book 7, it was a lot slower because I felt like the characters were all kind of like trying to like work on getting their way towards this goal, but they weren't really making any progress. And then I can't remember if it happens at the end of the last book or the start of this one, where a group of our characters managed to actually find this thing that they've been looking for and use it, and then in the using of this thing they've been looking for, it kind of triggers like a bunch of things happening in the other characters' kind of perspectives, storylines. So I felt that in this one, the plot actually advanced quite a bit, and a lot of the characters were able to move towards all their goals and plans that have been building up for throughout the last book. And this book really kind of takes you for a ride, because I feel like throughout like most of this book, things are going well, the characters are moving towards their goals, as I said, and then kind of like in the last like few pages, shit just kind of like hits the fan and stuff starts to go wrong, and then the book ends, which I think was really well done in like setting up for the next book and making me want to pick it up right away. And then finally, I just finished listening to this one this morning. I read A Starry Messenger by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and unfortunately I only gave this one 2.5 out of 5 stars. I felt like it kind of failed to make a point. Like, he's kind of discussing from like a scientist, kind of physicist perspective, things that exist like in our world, like different like stances, like political stances or whatever. And I just really felt like he was kind of meandering from one topic to the other without like effectively tying them together or making like really in-depth insights. And I was kind of just like, I don't know, like it was okay, but I just didn't really feel like it was that interesting, you know? So I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you listen to this one. And then finally, I did actually DNF my first book this month. I don't think I've ever like actively chosen to put a book down and not pick it up again. Like, there have been books where I kind of like sort of forgot I was reading them, but this one I just like actively chose not to finish. And the book is The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. And this book has such like an interesting premise, like, or like interesting like world building, because like all the worlds are like kind of like there's like separate worlds within this world that are like linked by gateways that go to this place called like the Maze, where like people will like sail on like maze ships to get to the other world. And I felt like that was like a really interesting like world concept, but it just like, I don't know, it was utilized kind of in some interesting ways, but really overall I just felt like the plot was not that interesting. Like, we have our main character who is from like one world, and then she gets like rescued by this guy because she's supposed to be kind of like a sacrifice to her god or whatever. And I don't know, I just felt like she doesn't really develop as a character. Like, she just, throughout everything that sort of is happening after, she just like so fixated on like, oh, this guy saved me, so it can be like the only thing that like I do in my life is to like serve him. Even like after she manages to like get this guy back into power in the city that he was like kicked out of. Like you would think that had like paid back whatever debt she had because she like risked it all to do this, but then we skip forward in time and we're doing something else and she's just still like really hardcore, like going for this guy, really wants his like approval, and it just like wasn't very interesting. She didn't feel like she was like developing or like growing as a character. She just kind of felt like, I don't know, like a foot soldier, and it just, I don't know. I didn't hate the book, and I think some people might like it, but I just kind of got bored, and I couldn't, and I felt like if I kept trying to like force myself to pick it up, I was gonna like put myself in a reading slump because I just like wasn't interested in picking it up, so I just wasn't reading. So I had to make the call to not finish it so that I could happily move on and read something that was more interesting. All right, so that is everything that I read in April. Overall, some really good reads and some not so good reads, but hey, you win some, you lose some. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.